High performance is the relentless execution of an elite process. High performer knows how to create the balance necessary.
Super needed in the business environment where we have leaders that have no time to do that because they're so much into the next thing.
It's about
what does it take to create high-performing teams and thrive under pressure, whether on the field or in the boardroom? In this episode, I sit down with Steve Tashjian, founder of the Elevation Project and high-performance coach to elite athletes and business leaders alike. So from coaching World Cup teams to preparing CEOs for the challenges of 2025, Steve reveals the secrets behind balance, adaptability, and turning pressure into your greatest asset. So if you want to redefine what high performance means for yourself and your team, this conversation will leave you inspired and ready to take action.
in an environment of chaos and unpredictability, it's going to make the pressure worse. If I have the opposite, more predictability, more order, it makes the pressure easier. You're still going to have to be in situations where you've got great ideas within your team and you need the ability to use the traits of agility to make great decisions and steer when it's necessary. But aspects of all of that are made easier when we can lean on processes. Can you answer the question, who are we? If you can't answer that question.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leaders. So today I'm excited to have with me someone that does something I do, but primarily sports. But today we'll explain his work, with business leaders. So that is Steve Tashjian. Steve is a high performance coach and is the founder of Elevation Project, which collaborates with elite organizations, communities, and institutions to build high performance teams and systems. Steve is a renewed leader and has prepared 3 athletes for the Kona Ironman, boxer for the world title fights, the U.S. men's soccer team for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, and also Matt Fitzpatrick for the 2023 PGA Championship and U.S. Open Golf. He's also an expert physical therapist, sports scientist, and movement specialist. He was also the first full-time American performance specialist in the English Premier League. So for those people that are listening in the UK, that will resonate. Leading the sports science efforts for Everton Football Club, facing teams like Manchester United, Liverpool, and you name it. So beyond sport, he has coached many executive VPs that I want to talk about. So Steve, thank you so much for being on the show today.
I appreciate it, Andrea. I've been really looking forward to this one. Thank you so much.
Yeah, look, and to me, it's such a fascinating topic because bringing lessons from those people that do what I do, but in a sports environment, and draw, conclusion into the business world is fascinating because that's to me there is something to learn, and I still don't believe many business leaders they really capture all these lessons. So I think it's a great opportunity and platform for you to share a little bit more of that. So let me start, Steve, as the question asked to everybody when we start. I'm looking for a short but also sweet answer. So what does it truly mean to be a CEO in 2025 now that we're heading into the new fiscal year? So what aspects of this role do people often misunderstand or overlook?
Yeah, I think it's evolved into really understanding the importance of the facilitation, of the multiplication, of the conduction that is really required. I facilitate by being the individual that knows how to provide the resources for people to execute. Creating strategic plans is more the facilitation of the creation of a strategic plan. The multiplier piece is, can I 10x my talent? That's really more indicative of successful companies and CEOs in 2025.
Nice.
Conduction. Am I a conductor like the LA Philharmonic? Can I bring harmony around multiple stakeholders, vertically, horizontally, around the alignment of a purpose? I think that's the modern CEO, facilitator, multiplier, conductor.
Yeah, well, we could probably stop here because these we can unpack these three terms because there is a lot to do, a
Sure.
lot to talk about these 3 terms, and I'm sure that we will unpack during the
Yeah.
episode. But let's actually start unpacking the real definition of high performance. You your title is high performance coach. I do high performance coach in a business environment. So there are definitely, some synergies, but I'm interested to understand from you, given that you have worked with so many of the world actually top athletes and executives too. So what defines really the DNA of a high performer and how these traits actually translate into the corporate world? So let's try to start, building a bridge between the sports experience that you have into the business world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think from 200,000 feet, defining high
Mhm.
performance is important, and it's obviously very difficult also. But if you were to try to create a statement that can create an umbrella that high performance falls under, I've really simplified it down to high performance is the relentless execution of an elite process. I think that kind of sums it up for me because all the key characteristics we're going to talk about, if they don't lead to the creation of systems and processes, then it's really hard to create sustainable high performance. And then the DNA question is interesting because, we can list a million characteristics, but the truth of the matter is they all live on a spectrum, right? If you're talking about uh, conviction versus curiosity, the high performer knows how to create the balance necessary. So I'm going to give you one word from a DNA perspective is, balance. They're amazing creators of balance because we're not really, it's not as simple as 5 key characteristics and you'll be a high performer. It's not it. It's about, how do I create the balance necessary in every given moment on the spectrum of, intensity and tension to, peace and relaxation. How do I create
Yeah.
the balance between the one I gave you earlier? Lethal conviction, decisive decision making, and total curiosity and exploration of why. Each given circumstance might require you to be on point on a different spot on that spectrum, right? High performers are amazing at knowing that balance. Amazing collaborators versus seekers of solitude. The high performance, depending on the moment, requires both.
Yeah.
And high performers just have this incredible ability to know where the balance point is. Teacher, mentor to student, and individual in a moment of growth on their own, journey to mastery. The balance between those. Hyper focus, task oriented executor versus global expanded total awareness of surroundings. And, those are two completely, they're on the same spectrum, but they're at opposite ends of that spectrum. And high performers know how to just find those sweet spots, team leader, team member. Like, where do you fall on there? And that's what they are. They're incredible creators of balance as it relates to the circumstance and what's needed in the circumstance, whether they're on the field or whether you're in a boardroom. There are no scripts. You're going to have to know the circumstance and the situation, your audience, right? Who you're leading down to, who you're leading up to, and you just have to understand, how to thin slice the situation and know where you have to fall on all these spectrums so that you have the right balance of really these
Yeah.
important traits that sometimes can be, diametrically opposed to one another.
Yeah, and I call it context. So once you understand the context where you're operating in, then if you have that balance, you're able to, adapt yourself, make all the necessary changes or adaptation that requires you with a level of flexibility and curiosity, as you correctly pointed out, you can actually do that. So I love that. And to me, that's already a very strong, important distinction that I think it's worth talking about it because I think there is a myth, right? Especially for those people that are looking at the sport, or in other words, look at to the best performers from a non-expert angle, like your angle, because you have been there in the trenches. It's more like, you know, potentially there is a myth that performance comes with a peak performance, meaning you have to be incredible good or sustaining peak performance all over the time. But my takeaway from what you're saying is actually is balancing those moments of incredible performance and focus, etc., to those moments where you need to actually rest and relax and think more about it. And to me, that is already such an important distinction. By the way, super needed in the business environment where we have leaders that have no time to do that because they're so much into the next thing, isn't it?
I have a really, really talented client of mine that I've watched, you know, operate in a certain way at, a global GLT meeting, right? Where
Mm,
it's
mm.
how are we creating real useful time of these really intelligent people I have in the room and hearing the great ideas, understanding how to kind of, hey, let's pull this together, narrow it into our plan, and then watch them in the boardroom execute, right? In
Mm.
one situation, it was about everybody else. It was about the collaborative, right? It was about this really insightful question asking individual that was able to, magnify everybody's intelligence, amplify everybody's ideas through the questions that he asked. And then when I saw it in the boardroom, it was, no, I'm on, you know, now it's my
Yeah.
turn. And just delivered with ruthless communication, you know, incredibly concise presentation of this strategic plan as it related to short-term and long-term. Like I saw this individual in two different realms, and it paints the perfect picture of what we're talking about. Like all these things are contextual, and regardless of the high performance trait, they were on one end of the spectrum at the GLT meeting. They were on the other end of the spectrum in the board meeting, just delivering and
Interesting.
executing. So really, really interesting to know that that's like, to see it in action was really cool, in a non-sporting environment, but also recognizing it's the same. The
Yeah.
traits are identical, and the ability to move along that spectrum is identical in both environments.
How can you find that balance, especially with those individuals that have a tendency to be more into the extremes, meaning, they're very strong because they have this tendency to do X, Y, or Z and less about other things. How can you find the balance? And besides the example that you gave, is there any other example, maybe from the sport industry, of someone that, you know, has really show up in that way? And definitely you help him, but walk us through that sort of process or change of mindset from being, performer when it's needed to to be sustainable, to have a more sustained performance through balance. How can you do that in people?
I think the individuals that are best at it, they're the ones that recognize their biases
Mm.
quickest. Because when we get locked into a certain profile of behavior, it's very much tied to our past experiences, our
Yes.
upbringing, our
Yes.
environments, our culture, and we'll operate working in the subconscious for years until we have an aha moment, either through a mistake we've made or through a great friend that tells us, hey, have you seen this about yourself? Have you thought about this? So the starting point is that in order to really open up the freedom of moving along an entire spectrum, it's not so much about amplifying a skill as it is about taking away the obstacles. You know, let's remove the things that are preventing you from really moving laterally from left to right. And, I'm sure you've seen this yourself with your clients. I've certainly seen it with mine, where you can clearly hear the bias that is influencing a decision or influencing a certain way of thinking, or maybe the fuel behind a continued mistake that's being made over and over and over again. But it's not really about drawing attention to it our way. It's really about, can I lead them to seeing it for themselves? Because once they do, it's like, okay, I if I can remove this obstacle, then it opens things up tremendously. It's a really interesting analogy here to this, Andrea, is I'm a musician as well. I have a real passion for the performing arts, and I've in music, as I've started to work more as a sound engineer, I'm working with sound files a lot. Recorded music, and you're trying to get the best out of what has been recorded. And what I'm finding is the starting point, great engineers, what they know is don't go in right away and boost all the frequencies along the spectrum that you like. Don't do that first. The first thing you do is you have the sound file, remove the harsh frequencies you don't like first.
Interesting.
You'll be amazed at what you couldn't hear because the harsh frequencies were getting in the way. It's amazing. It's very similar with biases. It's very similar with decision-making and spectrums around high-performing traits. Remove the things that are stopping you from seeing the width of the spectrum.
Yes.
You'll be amazed what you couldn't hear or see because of your own biases that were creating obstacles to the width of your vision and the width of what you could hear. And so that's a big part of this.
And there is a wonderful English word, I call it clearing, meaning if you're able to get clearing, so you can essentially get expanded by removing the things that are blocking you, that is really when the magic happens. I think clearing is a fantastic way to describe what you're just saying. The only question I have, because look, most of my work is about mindset. So when I work with corporate leaders, we really tend to, unlock their potential by changing the way how they see things. And but primarily start with themselves, right? As you mentioned, you did not use the word awareness, but that's essentially what we're talking about. Because if you're not aware about what is stopping you, you keep doing the same thing and nothing really changes, right? So from your perspective, how can you really do that? You said removing things, removing the biases, removing perception that are affecting you in the shaping your action, removing for some people, especially those people that they had a really difficult, you know, be past experiences in whatever shape or form. It could be in family, it could be as a performer, it could be whatever. Their past experiences, they are anchored them in a moment of fear, a moment of lack of confidence. How can you do that, with individuals from your perspective?
Honestly, there's times, Andrea, where I realize I'm not the one because it's clinical. And so the first starting point that I would say from the safety of the individual's perspective is, as it's being explored in this very trusting relationship between you and the client, there's times when you realize, okay, I've just heard something or seen something that triggers me to know that this has a real clinical need. And I've had the conversation with people where I've had to say, listen, man, I think this requires, for you to see somebody. This requires a clinical application to understand this particular trauma, this particular experience, and the way it's
Of course, we're
affecting your
talking about the
decision making.
extreme here, right? So those people that have
Totally,
been
correct.
heavily
Correct.
traumatized by something,
Totally.
right?
But
Not everybody.
you see it in CEOs all the time, Andrea. It can be the reason why they've been driven all the way to the top their whole life. And it's happening more often than I thought I would see it. Now, the other end of it, the less extreme part of it, really comes down to, in my opinion, is, providing as much knowledge as possible. Because in the end, if we have a trusting relationship with them, yes, they'll believe us when we say, here's some things to maybe think about, because there's a world that you need to explore.
Yeah.
And in order to see it, there's an expansion that needs to take place. I'll use my own example, my own life as an example. In the middle of the World Cup cycle, I was 2 years in to working with a colleague that now is one of my most trusted colleagues.
Just for
And
context, we're talking about the Men Football World Cup 2022 in Qatar.
Correct. The U.S. men's national team. This is about 2020 now. We're at the end of COVID, going into 2021. And he had a really interesting conversation with me we had touched on it a few times over the 2 years, just about my conviction, the way I approach decision making, how quickly I will use a bias and I will turn it into fact and I'll start making decisions off of it, right? At one end, he was very complimentary in saying it's the reason why you get a lot done. You're decisive. A lot of times you're right, but when you're wrong, you catastrophically make mistakes. It was just an honest moment, and we did explore that. And I started thinking about it more and tried to be aware of it more. But sport moves at an incredible speed.
Right.
But the moment that did it was he sent me a Christmas gift. And he sent me a book. And the book is called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me, by by Carol Tavris, who's a great author. Honestly, she also has a book on anger that's amazing.
Right.
But when I saw the title, it just punched me right in the face. I knew exactly what he was saying. He was basically saying, I love you. And what I've done so far hasn't worked, not as well as I'd like it to. He knew, hey, this is a guy that explores, likes to learn, but has to be shown, he has to see it on his own, or else he doesn't make big changes in his life. And I read that book, Andrea, there was an inscription on the inside, that said, I just thought you would really like this book. What he really meant was, you really need to change, man. And I love you. And this has got to happen. And then I did. I read the book, man, and it floored me. I was so
Yeah.
convicted by that book, and it changed me. All of a sudden, I could see the whole spectrum. And for me,
Interesting.
the mindset change had to come a certain way. So when you're trying to change mindset in individuals, you might go into a relationship, Andrea, and just based on your experience, you've got so much leverage because of the way they respect you. You might just be able to speak gospel, and it all of a sudden has an incredible impact. So in and of itself, the relationship and the way you approach CEOs really is about creating rapport, creating trust, and then understanding their learning style as quickly as possible. And you have to direct your consultation and your advisory administration directly to the mode that speaks. And you'll find real behavioral change as a consequence of that. But mindset is a product of experience. So if we're going to engage in the process of changing mindset, you just automatically start to realize how gigantic of a task that is when I'm trying to change the influence of experience in a short period of time. You have to have that impact in a certain way. It has to be really focal, directed towards the way in which the individual learns. And that's not just for CEOs, that's for players
It's
too.
for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, it's for everybody.
So I love that. I love the point that you're making in terms of I'm focused on the experience, because by changing their worldview or their point of view about the experience, they can start to see something else. I love that. And that is a perfect segue to the other point that is important, not only to me, but the people at least I work with. I'm sure many, many,
Oh,
many people in this podcast is about the pressure. And you come from an environment where pressure is top of mind for everybody, because you
right.
constantly work under pressure to
Yeah.
perform. Because you mentioned before, in sports, unlike to be in business, unless there are some moments that potentially are similar, but in sports, you don't have the time frame that you have in business to go back and to the next meeting and prepare, etc. So you have to make quick decision, but you need to deal with the pressure of expectation, results, and whatever comes with that. So tell me a little bit more about, how can you thrive under pressure? Because everybody says it, but the reality is when pressure comes, then many, many people really struggle to deal with that. And
Yeah.
my view right now is, especially in business, I mean, the level of pressure is increasing for a number
Hmm.
of circumstances that we don't need to talk about right now. So I think it's important to understand your view. And I think that is a perfect analogy we can take from sport and moving, and translate into business. How can we really thrive under pressure?
I try to simplify this a lot. It's good to ask the question, what makes pressure worse? And for me, what makes pressure worse is chaos and unpredictability. So if I'm pressed up against the end of the quarter
Right.
and there's enough pressure already as I'm approaching the end of a quarter, right? But on top of it, I operate in an environment of chaos and unpredictability, right? We know that's no brainer. It's going to make the pressure worse, right? Well, I can argue that if I have the opposite, it makes the pressure easier. If I've got more predictability and I've got more order, I'm probably going to be able to deal with pressure better. And if I could pinpoint one thing that made pressure easier to deal with in sport, it's that we continued to always focus on what our systems and processes were. This is how we operate. And as you build that playbook, you continue to ease chaos and you continue to create more predictability. You can't make something perfectly predictable. That's a no-brainer. You're still going to have to be in situations where you've got great ideas within your team and you need the ability to use the traits of agility to make great decisions and steer when it's necessary. But aspects of all of that are made easier when we can lean on processes. The World Cup is a great example. We got
tell
to
me
the World
more.
Cup, Andrea. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, tell me more about, the World
Yeah.
Cup experience.
So the World Cup should have been the most stressful
Yes.
tournament of my 4 years. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I've never been more relaxed in a tournament in my life. We had
Interesting.
spent 4 years using every international competition as a testing ground
Right.
for what our process would be at the World Cup. Whether it was how we used data, whether it was how we, implemented our recovery strategies, whatever it might be. A great example is we're playing the Gold Cup in the summer of 2021 in the United States, where it's going to be 100 degrees with 90% humidity. All right, we're going to use that tournament to determine what our heat mitigation strategies are going to be at the World Cup in Qatar, in the Middle East.
Right.
We're playing the Nations League final against Mexico in Denver at altitude. We're going to use it to understand how we're going to implement our own altitude acclimatization strategies for when we play Mexico and Mexico City for World Cup qualifying. Everything was a testing ground for a final. Everything was a testing ground for the World Cup. And along the spectrum of what's involved in high performance in sport, there's obviously a lot of columns you need to create process for. But when we got to the World Cup, we knew who we were. We knew how we operated. We knew our systems, our processes, and we knew the elite results that they would give us. I've never been more present and aware in a tournament in my entire career. We were ready. So it should have been chaos. It should have been tension, anxiety, and nerves, and it wasn't. I was able to enjoy every second of that tournament because I was ready to lean on our process because I had confidence that it would give us the results over and over and over again. That's the same thing in business, right? You have situations where you need to go from product to development to product launch. What's our process? What's our systems? And in that world, from a retail space, that involves everybody, right? I have engineers that are producing products. I've got supply chain that has to make sure I have supply as it relates to product launches. I have marketing that requires the planning of how we target the release, how we communicate it, how we message it, how we deliver it. I shouldn't be starting all over again every time I do this. And the tension and pressure that comes with today is launch day. Are we going to net the way we predicted? That anxiety is eased when I've done this before. When I've used this system and I've used these processes and it's driven success. I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but it makes things more predictable.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, I've decreased the likelihood of chaos. And if we don't understand that everything we do lives in a system and that those processes are what creates the efficiency of that system, then we're always going to struggle with pressure. And the
So
more
I
and more we think about that from a process perspective, the more
yeah,
we can calm the issues that come with. That's how sport does it. Elite sport deals with pressure through process.
I agreed. And to me, if I translate to business, of course, system and processes, they're words that business leaders they use every single day. But if we look a little
Yeah,
bit at a higher level, it's all about preparation. It's preparation
correct.
to the level of detail so you are ready for whatever is coming. And to me, it's a fantastic message for those people there, for example, and I see many in my world, is leaders, they are actually come to very critical moments to engage people unprepared. Like, I'm gonna improvise, I'm gonna share what I think. I think what we are suggesting here is get to the level of preparation through, season process so you can really deal with the chaos and trying to make it as easy as possible. I wouldn't say it's not an objection, but really just to play devil's advocate. I'm interested
Yeah.
to your view about one
Mm.
element that is a potential disruption, regardless.
Yes.
Meaning is the human being, because human
Sure.
beings are highly unpredictable. Meaning you can't prepare as much as you want. You can prepare a system process, but the reality is human systems. They can get in a very different situation as soon as they're triggered by something. In the match, I can believe, you prepare everything and then you get a goal, after 2 minutes, you have to change your game instantaneously. Or, you're starting to get the game start to get so nervous because the other team, they're gonna start playing, you know, tough because they want to play with your mind. How can you really do this when you deal with humans? Because where is sport business, we deal with human all the time.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to ladder up first,
Mhm.
and then I'll get a little bit specific to answer that. For me, laddering up would say that human behavior, as it relates to team behavior, organizational behavior, really comes down to how well have we defined who we are. I'm a
Mm.
big believer in the power of alignment around purpose, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Really drilling that down, waterfalling that down to, do we know what our mission is? Do we know what we're trying to accomplish every day?
Uh-huh.
And then down to our values, our DNA, our way of working. Do we know what our values are? Because as it relates to what you're saying from a consistency of human behavior perspective, then my question would be, okay, consistency to what? Right? We want to be consistent in our behavior. If that's the case, and I'm a team member at your company, my first question is going to be, what am I aligning to? Right? Are we clear that we know who we are? So that's the ladder up. And I'm sure you know it. I was surprised by it, how few, even very successful companies, can answer the question, who are you? It's very interesting. The next thing after that, when you're starting to work your way down to the individual, right? Now it's moment of execution. And this is big for athletes. Whether it's basketball with 100 and something games, baseball that has even more, or even football, soccer, where you're somewhere between 40 and 60 games a year, it is hard to reproduce excellence every single match. And something very interesting was introduced to me that I didn't necessarily gravitate to in the beginning, but I'm a big advocate of it now, is that you need to have a plan as an individual for how you're going to execute when you don't have your A game. This happens. The snowball is when people try to chase their A game and they just don't have it. And something somebody said to us, I'm trying to remember who the speaker was that came to spoke to us with the national team, said, some days all you have is your B game. Some days all you have is your C game. What you need to do is make it the most consistent B game you can. The issue with the yips, the issue with having these chronic moments where one mistake seems to snowball into the next mistake, is not because we're off. It's because we don't accept where we are and we keep trying to chase our A game. And as you try to chase your A game on a day where you don't have it, your mistakes will start to stack up. So from a CEO's perspective, if I'm in the boardroom and I know I don't have it and it's not a perfect day, don't try to chase a perfect day. That is going to be catastrophic. Stay within what you know you have, right? Stabilize it, correct it at your next opportunity. But if you try to chase your A game in that moment, in my experience now sitting here, 48 years old, having been in professional sport for over 20 years, and now just kind of seeing what the psychological mentality looks like of catastrophic collapses in the sporting arena, the individual was right. It comes from trying to chase something you're not.
Yeah.
So that's, it's something to think about in those moments where you're talking about human behavior is really the last piece of execution, right? I can have a perfect plan, but I need people to execute. And in that moment, you might be like, oh, two things make up for it. One, the individual can't start chasing something they're not. And two, my environment and values around collaboration and stronger together means the rest of my team will pick me up. The rest of my team will see it, be aware of it. But if I haven't instilled stronger together as a part of my values, now me as an individual making mistakes, I'm on an island. So it's two-part. Do the values of my organization allow me to have a collaborative process that provides support for my blind spots, for my moments where I don't have my A game? And two, as an individual, have I been told that it's safe in my environment to realize I don't have it today and I'm going
Yeah.
to stay the course? I'm going to figure this out at the next opportunity to make it better. I think those are two critical things to kind of answer that question about execution.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting and I love that. And I think it's a different way of thinking and seeing, yourself in these moments. And I love that. I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from what you just shared. Now, that leads me to a next question. I mean, you said unified goals, purpose, we are there together, but you also just mentioned, if someone has your back during when you have, your big game, not the A game, that's really the power of working in a strong team. But when it comes to team, you have a lot of experience working with teams. One thing that, you and we spoke a little bit earlier was not today, but when we were preparing for this call, one important element is the way how teams think and operate. So, and that is another fantastic, conversation that happens all day is actually in business when every leader has this fear about group thinking, meaning everybody thinking the same way. How can you really drive innovation, foster something different, create a breakthrough when people see the same thing and they operate in the same thing? So how can you find back to the balance between unified, aligned, collaboration, working together, but also allowing the individuals to express their maximum potential in the team setting?
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what we talked about in the opening warm-up question. We really talked about the conductor piece of leadership. You're trying to outline boundaries, the boundaries for what allows us to be who we are as a group when we're thinking about the direction of our purpose as a company. The values that we create those boundaries. If we create those boundaries in a way with our values where the operating space is too small, then we do start to create people. Our environment is creating people that think the same way. So that's one piece of this, is the breadth and width of the boundaries your values create have to leave space for the creativity and the diversity of ideas that lives in your group. Now, that being said, diversity of ideas inside a team doesn't happen by accident.
No,
We have to purposely
it's by
be
design.
thinking about how we're building our teams.
Yes.
And, we want diversity everywhere in our organizations. And I think what's really important is to make sure that we're talking about several different types of diversity. We want ethnic diversity. We want diversity in experiences. We want diversity in genders. But we want diversity in ideas. When we're sitting in front of candidates and we're filling a need, my number one question I'm always asking as I'm learning more about the individual is, what unique skill set will this person bring to the team? I've passed on really, really, really smart, great candidates because they were too similar to somebody I already had. And so you have to build the diversity purposefully. You have to create boundaries that are tight enough to make sure that when you see or hear a behavior you don't like, they're going to feel the boundary. You're going to feel me. But at the same time, have the width so that in those moments where creativity is going to put you over the top, the individual feels the safety and the ability to really lean into their creativity and diversity in those moments. Like, you have to create it. None of it happens on accident. Not in sustainable environments anyway. Right.
No, not at all.
So I think that's a key to this. Now, groupthink by itself is also massively driven by the individual at the top, because groupthink can also be about the end idea that's always accepted, because you can have a tremendous diversity of ideas being given, but if you continue to pick the same type of idea as a leader, then I'm creating the groupthink as I'm looking at it from an execution and end product idea. My execution and end product might look exactly the same every single time with no agility, because I'm the one making the decision to continue to pick the same type of idea every time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Steve, thank you. That was, by the way, fully agree with this point. I think that is essentially what every organization really should see and should think about diversity with that, through these lens and not through other policy lens. So that's really what diversity supposed to be in organization. That's wonderful. I have a last question for you, Steve. If we wrap
Yes.
up, all the conversation that we had, I'm interested. What a CEO can take away from this? What is one thing, one strategy, one practice that CEOs, but to that matter, every really leader that is listening to the show today can take away and said, I'm gonna do this, because we talked about pressure, we talked about balance, we talked about thinking, diversity, and teams. What is one thing that we want really to leave the audience today with, so they can really feel like, okay, I'm gonna make some different for myself?
Yeah, I think at this point, if I had to pick one, the starting point has to be the foundation around, can you answer the question, who are we? That's critical for me, because, the rest of it really relies on that as a foundation to create success within any organization. From at that point, the rest of the things that are important to a leader, to be a multiplier, to increase talent, to facilitate. How do I multiply talent on top of a foundation that's crumbling? For me, it's really about answer that question. If you can't answer that question, then, in my opinion, you really have an immediate need to assemble a task force and create the resources around identifying what that is. Survey your organization, outline what it was, the impact you want to have on the world as it relates to your purpose. Pick that one thing that's bigger than yourselves that you can impact, and start to define how that details your way of operating on a daily basis and the DNA, the values that establish the way in which you work. If you can answer that question, great. If you can't, that needs to be answered before you can create sustainable success for the organization.
Yeah, I agree. That's really a fantastic way to end this conversation. Is really the North Star. The North Star starting where we are
Yeah.
as individuals
Yeah.
and as teams.
Yeah.
Amazing, Steve. So where people should go if they want to know a little bit more about you, your story, your work, tell us a little bit more where
Sure.
people could find you.
You can find me on LinkedIn. That's a great way to do it. And then my website, the company again is called The Elevation Project, and the website is elevationprox.com.
Amazing. Steve, thank you so much. As expected, I was really look forward to this conversation. I know I was going to learn something, and that complements perfectly, the work I do. So I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience today, they took something interesting because we talk about great things. So thank you so much, Steve, for being on the show.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it, Andrea. Thank you for having me.